One thing to understand about ancient Israel during the time when the temple was still standing is that there wasn't such a thing as a single Judaism. There were multiple Judaisms. Among them were the Pharisees, the Dead Sea sect, identified by many scholars as the Essenes, the so-called morning bathers, the Boethusians, the Therapeutae, known for effecting divine healing, the movement of John the Baptist, and of course, the Jesus movement. But without question, the most powerful sect in all of Israel were the Sadducees. They had come together in the 2nd century before the Common Era, during the reign of the Hasmonean king, John Hyrcanus. At the time, when the Pharisee party had effectively withdrawn from the government, the Sadducees allied with it. They were an aristocratic party made up of priests and Levites, plus rich landowners, courtiers, and merchants. Josephus says this of the Sadducees. Now the Sadducees, the second party, deny destiny altogether and place God beyond doing or seeing anything bad. They say that good and bad are dependent on human choice, and one may allow each of these according to one's own decision. They deny the soul's permanence, as well as rewards and punishments in the underworld. Now the Pharisees love one another and practice consensus in their community. But the Sadducees behave rather aggressively, even toward each other. And they are harsh in debates among themselves, as with others. Jewish War II, 164 to 166. He also relates, "For now, I wish only to explain that the Pharisees transmit to the people some rules in line with the fathers, which were not written in the laws of Moses. And because of this, the line of the Sadducees reject these things. They say that it is necessary to uphold those rules that have been written, but it is not necessary to observe what is only from the fathers' tradition. And as a consequence, controversies and great disagreements have occurred between them." The Sadducees persuade only the well-to-do and have no popular following. But the Pharisees have the masses as allies. Antiquities 12, 297 to 298. There isn't any doubt that the name Sadducees, Tzdukim in Hebrew, is related to the Hebrew verbal form sadak, to be righteous. But exactly how it's related is unclear. The meaning of the name is related to theories about the origin of the sect. One theory is that the Sadducees were named after Tzadok, the father of the priestly families in Solomon's time. So it would be a fitting name for the party in Jerusalem that was characterized for so long as priestly. But not all the Sadducees were priests, and some of the members of the Essene community at Qumran were priests of the Zadokite line. And remember, the Hasmoneans brought an end to the Zadokite priesthood, since they were of a different house, that of Hashmon, which would leave the use of the name Sadducees as a title without actual substance. Another theory is that they were named after a disciple of the ancient sage Antigonus of Soho. Antigonus stressed that people should serve God with no thought of reward, which is why, as the theory goes, he was reputed not to believe in resurrection or life after death, opinions later shared by the Sadducee party. Antigonus taught a sage known as Boethus, who in turn formed the Boethusians, another of the Judaisms of late antiquity. They, it's theorized, may have been the Herodians of the New Testament. Another theory is that the Essenes, presumed writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, themselves were the Herodians. In any case, the son of Boethus, we're told, was appointed high priest by King Herod. Another disciple, Zadok, would have been one of the early leaders in the party that took his name, the Sadducees. A third view is that the name is simply related to tzaddik, righteous one, tzaddikim for the plural. This would be similar to, but also in contrast to, the Hasidim, the pious ones, the early title for a group we'll be spending some more time discussing, out of which developed the Pharisees. Most treatments of the Sadducees assume that all the chief priests and other leaders of Judaism belonged to this party. But Josephus doesn't say that. He says only that those priests who were Sadducees came from the governing class. And Josephus only refers to an individual Sadducee, Ananus, the high priest. Wrote Josephus, "This Ananus, who took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. The Sanhedrin of judges was assembled, and they brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king Agrippa, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more. For what he had already done was not to be justified. For it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin without consent. On which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him when he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus, the son of Damnaeus, high priest." Josephus's identification fits the class of Sadducees, since Ananus was from the highest level of society and was stern in justice. Probably a relatively small number of the governing class was Sadducean, but we have no way of knowing for sure. The Sadducees, though, did live near the Jerusalem temple, in the most lavish villas of the city. The remains of those villas are still visible in an amazing subterranean excavation known today as the Herodian Quarter. Josephus says they were able to persuade none but the rich, meaning, among other things, that they had a small following of their peers, whereas the Pharisees were backed by the masses. does seem that both Sadducees and Pharisees made up the great Sanhedrin, though the Sadducees held more of the leadership positions. Nonetheless, they most often had to submit to the demands of the Pharisees, because the people backed the Pharisees. The Sadducees then were forced to observe the Pharisees' oral tradition, even though they preferred to deal with the written law only. Written laws left uninterpreted were vague, which would mean that they were free to decide what they meant. But the Pharisees usually got their way, even when a Sadducee was high priest. The Sadducees are generally painted as harsh and arrogant. Since they held power and competed with others for it, they were called boorish, rude to their peers, and quick to dispute with the teachers of law. We can say in general that the Sadducees had a conservative attitude towards Scripture, and that it was the Pharisees who were the liberal, moderate ones. The Sadducees restricted authority to the written law as interpreted literally, and were not open to change. But the question that is raised concerns how much of Scripture they accepted as Holy Writ. It's often assumed that they accepted only the law of Moses. But this may be a misunderstanding. When Josephus says they rejected all but the written law, he probably meant that they didn't permit legal deductions from the prophets. He possibly meant that they opposed unwritten traditions. According to the Talmud, the Sadducees, when attacked by those citing other books of the Bible, used those books themselves in their arguments. Of course, the Pharisees had a large body of oral interpretation that had become binding. It was this that the Sadducees opposed. The Sadducees, nonetheless, had their own halakha, but they didn't claim that it was divinely authoritative, as the Pharisees had done for their interpretations. Although the Sadducees held Scripture as the sole authority, they also believed that it should be modified by logic, especially in matters of doctrine. And if interpretations of the Pharisees were not binding, then others could decide for themselves what it meant. In this respect, the Sadducees would not be viewed as conservatives by the Pharisees, since in their opinion, the Sadducees were not safeguarding the traditional faith. The Sadducees, like all Jews, believed that the Torah, the law of Moses, was on a much higher plane than the rest of the Scriptures. It may be that the Sadducees believed that only the Torah was canonical, or that the Torah was vastly more important than other Scripture. But there isn't clear evidence for this. Still, their major complaint was that the Pharisees extended the canon with their own interpretations. One of the areas of debate between the Sadducees and the Pharisees concerned the calendar. Leviticus 23:15-16 begins the tabulation for the Feast of Weeks, that is Shavuot, with the expression, on the day after the Sabbath. The Sadducees said that Sabbath meant the Sabbath, and so Shavuot, the feast day, always fell on a Sunday. But the Pharisees ruled that Sabbath was the first day of Passover, Pesach, whatever that day was. And so the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, could actually come on any day. Now, this may seem like trivia to some, if not most, but it was a high-profile debate. According to Josephus, there was great disagreement regarding the human will. The Essenes were very deterministic. The Pharisees tried to combine determinism with free will. But the Sadducees believed that all human affairs result from human freedom. The fact that the Sadducees did not believe in divine apocalyptic interpretation or intervention in history could have given the impression that they denied the role of fate and saw everything as a matter of free will. But the evidence is clear that the Sadducees denied the doctrine of the resurrection. They kept their focus on the status quo of the nation of Israel in this world and not the next. There are some references in the Mishnah that also convey this tradition about their beliefs. According to Mishnah Brachot 9:5, the blessing ends from everlasting. But because the Sadducees said that there was only one world to guard against this idea, the sages changed the blessing to everlasting to everlasting. More importantly, however, is Sanhedrin 10:1, which records the general belief that all Israel has a portion in the world to come. It then lists those who do not, the Sadducees being among them, because they do not believe in the world to come. The reaction to the Sadducees was predictable. If they were not thoroughly despised by the Pharisees and by the people, they were at best tolerated. In the pseudepigraphal work, the Psalms of Solomon, written in the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Sadducees are simply called sinners. In the Mishnah, the Sadducees are listed with the ignorant of the laws, the deaf-mute, the imbecile, and the minor, because they would not admit to the legality of the ruling concerning the eruv, a ritual enclosure permitting Jewish residents to carry certain objects outside of their homes on the Sabbath. Nidah 4:2 affirms that the daughter of a Sadducee is equal to a Kuthian or Samaritan woman, probably because the Sadducees were lax in their purity laws. In fact, the Sadducees are grouped together with the Samaritans and the sectarians, minim or infidels, a term later used for Nazarene Jews in Brachot 9:5. In the later rabbinic literature, they're painted in even more lurid colors, as if they were heretics or not Jews at all.
So what do you think, Watson? Why should understanding the Sadducee party matter to us? Actually, that's a fairly important question, because down through the ages, most Christians have assumed that Jesus had a bone to pick with the leaders of his own faith. The Pharisees are lumped together with the Sadducees, and all are conspiring to have Jesus put to death. The tragic accusation that the Jews are Christ killers is the direct result of a complete misunderstanding of history. As we've seen, Jesus' natural allies were the Pharisees. He criticized the hypocrites among them, just as many Pharisees themselves did. But Jesus and the Pharisees, the real leaders of the faith, were basically on the same page. The natural enemies of both Jesus and the Pharisees were the Sadducees. It was they who denied the resurrection. It was they who denied the oral law. It was they who denied the very notion of a deliverer and a Messiah to come. In the famous incident in which Jesus came to the Jerusalem temple and overturned the tables of the money changers, he was directly threatening the Sadducees themselves. Many modern scholars assume that it was the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, not some dark conspiracy on the part of the Jewish leaders, who was solely responsible for putting Jesus to death. But another view holds that it was the Sadducees who directly appealed to Pilate to have Jesus crucified. Now, that's an important issue we still have to grapple with. In either case, it was by no means the will of the Jewish leadership, the Pharisees, to have Jesus executed. That dubious distinction will belong to the Sadducees. And that means that 20 horrible centuries of anti-Semitism are based on what amounts to a lurid lie. And that's something to ponder.